It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this evening, where we'll be looking and talking about George Baird's forthcoming book, or just released book, I guess, Writings on Architecture in the City. My name is Laura Miller, and I'm going to moderate this evening. And but before I do that, and before we begin, I'd like to introduce the rest of the people who have agreed to be part of this panel. Richard Sommer is an architect and urbanist with over 20 years of experience as practitioner, educator. I don't need to do that? Really? Okay. All right. Richard Sommer is the dean of this faculty, preceded by George Baird. I'll do, okay. There'll be enough talk. Okay. Robert Levit, associate professor of architecture, director of the program in architecture, and a partner in Curry Levitt Fong. Is that enough, Robert, or are you going to stop me too? Oh, yes. You're moderating the moderator, I will just say. So this seems to be, this will be an interesting evening to try and moderate this crew. Finally, all-known talkers. Finally, but not least, Roberto Damiani, who has been here at the Daniels faculty for several years now and is an Italian architect and is part of the design studio Damiani No Pfeiffer. And is that enough, Roberto, or shall I go on? No, you can stop. I can stop. Anyway, Roberto teaches in both the history theory seminars as well as the design studios here. And I already said, Laura Miller. So anyway, thank you all for being here. I thought, because I can see that it's going to be difficult for me to get a word in edgewise a bit later, that I might start first with a kind of impression to share with you about George. That was intended to be followed by an observation or two and finally a question, but I'm going to sever the observation, perhaps until I can interject it into our conversation, and simply talk about the circumstances under which, or in which I first encountered George Baird. The reason I wanted to do this this evening is because I think it helps to portray, as much as the collection of his essays does, what his role as an architectural critic and educator has meant. And that's not only to me, but to many, many students and colleagues with whom he has very generously shared his thinking and ideas. And I hope he doesn't mind that I do this. I know he's wont to begin an event or a thought with a kind of recollection. So in any case, I feel like there's precedent that I might be able to do this. In the late 1980s, I was a third-year architectural design student at Harvard's GSD, and George was then a visiting professor from Toronto. And soon, maybe the next year, in fact, I think you joined the faculty there. And that year, George offered a seminar that incited quite a lot of interest amongst the students there. And it was to be based on his work on Hannah Arendt and the question of public space. And the material that he presented to us was later to become part, of course, of his book, The Space of Appearance. After arriving at the first class, I was pretty dismayed to see that the room was already full. And the only space in the seminar room was one spot remaining on the floor at the center of the room against the wall. And owing to the fact that I came directly from another course before George's, that was my spot for the remainder of the semester, which is somewhat peculiar. And so those of you who only know about the noiseless click of PowerPoint presentations, you'll have to imagine this next part. But George would come in, walk to a stand which was opposite me at the center of the room against the other wall, and with a few words, he would turn the lights off entirely, and then a tray of slides would be thrust into the slide projector and clatter a bit, hopefully fit, and then be advanced one by one. And most of George's talks required at least 2 trays. Some of them, I think, went over that limit. And so that meant there was always a change in the middle. the slide projector as a kind of apparatus has a few affectations. And one of those affectations is that in between slides, if a slide didn't drop correctly, there would be a kind of flash of white light that would blast anyone that was in proximity until it did drop. Worse yet for me was that the heat of the projector required usually two fans. There was one that ran constantly and one that ran intermittently. And so that added to the sort of hum of the room, entirely dark. This hum required any speaker to project her or his voice above the whir of the fans. And because of the darkness, remember we couldn't text or check our emails or have a little flash party all by ourselves in a corner somewhere. It was George's distinct and sonorous voice that was the constant in that room. And by necessity, it was projected over the din of the room at a level that might be thought to only be reserved for a performance at a much sort of more distant range. But in fact, we were all jammed in there. And, but still, I maintain it was a performance by George's or anyone's standards. I wager a clearly phenomenal one, at least seen, or especially seen from the lower elevations of the floor. Because the bursts of light often coincided with the last emphatic point that George would make before he advanced to the next slide. And that, from my perspective, casts a kind of Dr. Caligari-esque shadow and rays of light on him before he returned to total darkness and his next point of argument. So I know that many former students, as well as colleagues of George's, who will agree with what I'm about to say. And that is that once knowing George's deep baritone voice, and especially maybe or kind of sort of, the particular idioms of his expression, they could not help but hear everything they read subsequently that was written by him in that very voice, as if it was narrated directly into their inner ear. And so as I read the essays for the book we're going to talk about tonight, it was indeed George's voice that I heard. But I also, because the experience of reading one essay after another, I was also struck by the degree to which he had laid out so lucidly in direct and even conversational terms ideas that in another voice might have been more difficult to apprehend. This is to say that George attends to the argument and that rhetoric matters. And if I get a chance, that would be a question that I want to come back to later on in the discussion.
So I'm very happy to be here to celebrate the publication of George's collected essays, writings on architecture and the city. As Francesco Garofalo points out in his introduction for the book, an architect who's also a critic and a scholar, as opposed to a professional historian, for an architect that's also a critic and a scholar, as opposed to perhaps a professional historian, the essay and the collection of essays, rather than the monograph or in a more old-fashioned way, the treatise, has been perhaps the most cogent way to get their ideas out. The collected essays have a more contingent relationship with the academic and professional world. One writes the things that one's colleagues, admirers, or friends ask them to, or to address specific situations and occasions. So collected writings are discursive in nature, and our ability to draw a position or theory from the span of collected written works depends on our ability to tease out various themes and theories from arguments made at different times for sometimes different audiences and about things for which the author may have more or less familiarity. George has, of course, written books, The Space of Appearance and others, that are more singular. But in many cases, even seminal books we think of as not a series of essays, are essays collected together as chapters around a related theme that hold together more or less. Books like Collage City come to mind, not only because Colin Rowe's work and influence are one of George's subjects in this book, but because Collage City is really a series of essays that were separately in circulation for years before they were published in a book, because Rowe's best form, in my opinion, really was the essay. Now, George, I like the really straightforward, no BS title of this collection. Writings on Architecture and the City. But I had to think that if Colin Rowe's collected works were titled, As I Was Saying, yours might have been an ongoing working hypothesis on architecture in the city, kind of, sort of. Now, others have commented on the dialogical nature of George's essays, and I think George just alluded to this, that when reading them, we feel we are entering into a conversation George is having with both himself and with others, and hopefully with us, especially if you've had the chance to hear George speak. This is both a reflection of the openness, I think, and generosity of George's personality and a sophisticated rhetorical technique. I would encourage our students to pay attention to how much he uses the first person. You'll see in the essays, he'll say, I went to the Disney concert hall, or I find myself questioning. And how rare this kind of engagement of an entry of oneself into writing is in architectural discourse of this kind. Like Laura, I read some of George's work before I met him, but then once I got to know him now, I can't read it without hearing that voice. But I also like this quality that I know that he's talking to others at the same time. Now, for full disclosure, I only received this book, or actually the stick with the text from the book this weekend, so I have not had a chance to read all of the newly published essays and have not reread some of the ones I've read in the past. But I want to speak, however, briefly to some of the things that I have read, or that I'm at least excited or provoked by in what's collected here. So the first thing I want to point out is that has always distinguished George and his work is his refusal to sign on with one disciplinary mafia, if you will. He engages in a form of flexible criticality with regard to his methods and intellectual affiliations. For example, when after the 1970s there was a split between those who ascribed to a phenomenological approach and those who took up a more semiotic structuralist approach, George insisted on the relative utility of both frameworks as ways to read and understand architecture. This became even more difficult when the influence of post-structuralism and later deconstructivist theories gave fuel to a kind of neo-avant-garde that forced everyone in the scene to take sides, which George didn't do. While he does have a distaste for the false posturing of the neo-avant-garde, he measures the sides, rather than taking sides, relative to the situation or works at hand. And you see that theme throughout the essays here. Now, I thought an interesting set of questions came to light at our conference this weekend, and George gave a virtuoso performance in the session called Use and Misuse of History. So some interesting questions came to light about the role of history and our relation to the present. In reading George's work, I'm struck by how many debates he has been part of and how many theoretical positions he has wrestled with in almost the past 50 years. I'm left with the question of whether, and in looking through this, I'm left with the question of whether the ideas and debates within our field have really changed and evolved as much as we sometimes think. Or whether we have sometimes changed the terms to produce a novel discussion of some of the same evolving phenomena. So that's something I'll want to come back to. Now, Francesco Garofalo talks, I think in the introduction, about three dimensions in George's collected works to date. His interest in the physical plane of architecture, his interest in the urban, and the urban or the city as a construct, and his interest in the political. When we organized the fest trip for George a few years ago, I argued that the political dimensions of George's work, for example, his interest in Hannah Arendt that Laura mentioned, and his and related theories of democracy, was what linked his sophisticated, sometimes very much inside the discipline, reading of canonical, or I guess we could say proto-canonical works. George's resuscitation or reinterpretation of Aalto Alvar comes to mind here in making his work canonical. I think this interest in the political links his interpretation of architecture with his interest in urbanism, or what we have come to lately call the problem of city building. Whether it's in the semiotics of dining, or the transgressive possibility of the picnic, or the collective experience of listening to music in two different kinds of concert halls, I find these occasions when George talks about social practice to be the potential link between architecture and the city, but I also want to talk about the limits of this kind of flexibility. I'll be done soon.
No, I'm looking and listening with interest.
So
Pleasure.
what I want to talk about is how George sees the difference between the way we interpret and work on and project architecture and the way we interpret, work on, and project the city. As his essays demonstrate, George insists on the phenomenological aspects of architecture, that architecture is a thing and it is still something that is physical and must be apprehended in person. And that is with our bodies. He always goes to the buildings he writes about and often makes the visit part of what he writes about. Yet the city is most of the time too big and complex to apprehend or experience in this way. It must be understood through approximations, representations, and other intermediate means. As I like to say, and I think Yves Blau said in our conference this weekend, no discipline can claim to have an exclusive or perhaps even fully adequate way to account for and therefore claim to master the urban condition. George acknowledges this in his later writings by pointing out how the obvious problem that most architects' theories and projects for the city fail to deal with its base, with the city's basis in the lot, in the block, and other property and real estate-based functions, at least in the capitalist city. If the city exceeds architecture's disciplinary and professional capacities to explain and plan it, what does that say for how we continue to think about making architecture itself? Rainer Banham said towards the end of his life that every building need not be architecture, and that the distinction between what was and wasn't architecture continues to have value. But if the context for architecture is the urbanized environment, how can we accept a complete schism between these two? So these are some questions I'll talk about. In this light, I read with great interest a previously unpublished article by George contained herein, entitled A Critical Reflection on the Theory and Practice of Architectural Symbolism in the work of Venturi, Rausch, and Scott Brown and their collaborators, and this was written in 1976, wherein George juxtaposes the seemingly blunt symbolism of Venturi and Scott Brown's theory of the decorated shed with Walter Benjamin's famous observation that architecture is the prototype of a work of art that the reception of which is consummated in a state of distraction. And later in the essay, quoting Cocteau, George advises, and this is 40 years ago, that tact in audacity consists of knowing how too far you can go. This is something I've heard him say since then, implying that the reduction of architecture to decoration on its exterior as a sign is too far, and sort of really implying a preference for the subtlety of Venturi's complexity and contradiction over the urban polemic of learning from Las Vegas. And so one of the things I want to discuss is whether, and I may ask him this, whether George still feels this way, and also, what the engagement of the commercial and of the kind of real politic of the city we found in Las Vegas says today. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I think who's next? Robert's next. Okay.
Okay. My remarks. No, I was looking at you because my remarks are not quite so prepared as yours. But I have to reiterate some of the points that people are observing about George's mode of communicating and this convergence of a conversational style which is live, which sounds like a written text, and a written text which sounds like conversation. And I think one of the effects of it, particularly in the written form, is that when I read George's work, that I often feel, and this is a quality which I recall having come across as being described as an ideal for writers, which is that they give you the impression that you've always already thought what they've written, what they've said, even though you know for a fact that that's not true, that you probably never thought it before. In my own case, because George has been so formative in my own thinking about architecture, even that is a more complicated question because I've been reading and following George's thoughts for perhaps about 20 years now. And in reading this book, one of the things that was a pleasure was recognizing George's own thoughts, but also some of my own formative experiences that arose through contact with George. I mean, it's also I think that one of the powerful things that happens in George's prose style is that because of the quality of this intimacy, that you feel like you're participating in the unfolding of the thoughts. And this is the thing that makes them so persuasive. I wanted to, something else, which is when you have a collection of essays which spans the period of production, which is now not quite 50 years, but nearly, I think they started in 1967, is that you have the impression that they are as if a synchronic work, that the whole thing happened all at once. And perhaps this is partly true because at least I have the impression in reading through, I have to admit, 200 of the 300 pages of the collected works in the last 2 days, that they do...
That's why you didn't have time to make more prepared...
Well, no, actually, it's just my nature, but I rely upon my extemporizing abilities. Mm-hmm. But anyway...
Touché.
I'm struck by the persistence of the themes and their relevance from the beginning to the end. And it gives the impression of what Isaiah Berlin called a hedgehog, which was someone who persisted with a set of ideas. And although it is strange at the same time that in the context of this persistence, that George is also so flexible in the range of things that he considers and the way that his work turns objects over for continuous reconsideration. In any case, with this in mind, I wanted to make some observations about the role that semiotics plays in the formative character of George's thought, and to, in a sense, pose some questions which I also hope that we will be able to come back to. Because one of the things that strikes me, I think that semiotics is, in disrepute, to borrow one of Venturi's words. And I think that often it's in disrepute in theory today, at least in part because of its association with a particular brand of postmodern architecture, which itself is also in disrepute, the more explicit forms of facadism and historicism. However, in George's hands, his description of the role of semiotic theory is one which he uses to describe the ways in which the use of language interpolates individuals into a world which is not of their making, but within which they are able to act. And it's where he mixes up, where he begins to blend at a certain point the idea of action that comes from Hannah Arendt with this notion that the use of the word parole in semiotic theory is interpolated against the backdrop of language, of a realm which is made by others and continues to be shaped through the interaction between individual actions and the community within which one operates. Anyway, the reason that this struck me as interesting is because it made me think again about why semiotic theory might be in disrepute in the contemporary scene. And that is because the emphasis which is placed so heavily upon the accommodation of individual distinction to borrow one of George's word, nowadays. I noticed that you use this word a lot to talk about the present, that nowadays the emphasis on individual distinction and the provisions that architecture might make to facilitate individual distinction are adverse to the recognition of the ways in which each of us is interpolated into a larger world which is not of our making and with which we must contend. And it is, in fact, and then I discovered in the first group of essays that George, in fact, describes what he considers to be one of the dilemmas and one of the objectionable characteristics of the architecture in the 60s, which he is criticizing, which is its desire to provide a kind of utilitarian backdrop against which individuals might imagine that they can unfold in a frictionless freedom, and that was namely in relationship to the Think Belt by Cedric Price, or on the other hand, in a kind of mandated and perfected world of, this is the Saarinen Tower for CBS is an equally strong proposition which describes an absolute system within which one must fit. So anyway, one of the questions which I would like to come back to is whether or not the circumstances which seem so deeply familiar in George's writing from the 1960s seem today to have persisted or mutated in new ways which carry forward some of those aspects from the past, but perhaps have unique qualities that may distinguish those circumstances of the present. I always like this very arcane word that Erwin Panofsky invented once upon a time called pseudo-isomorphism, in which he said, sometimes things recur in history and they look identical, but in fact they are very different. The circumstances in which they occur are very different, so they create misleading similarities. So I'm curious if the appearance of some of these observations and predicaments of the 60s are very similar to those of today, or whether or not they are fundamentally mutated in the circumstances of the present. I was going to return, there are many things which I probably would like to come back to, but like Richard, I also wanted to appreciate the ways in which George's work moved back and forth between what seemed like nearly autobiographic observations about buildings, namely in his consideration of the Disney Concert Hall and Hans Scharoun's Philharmonic, and the ways in which their similarity perhaps is belied by what turns out to be the real differences of organization of the social condenser that the Philharmonic is as compared to the Disney Concert Hall, which bears a similarity but is different. But in any case, it is through these intimate and autobiographical accounts of buildings that George's sometimes abstract considerations of architecture take on a very particular and empirical substance, which I think is a great strength and pleasure in his work. Let me end with one more thought, which I'd also like to come back to, because Richard alluded to the essay that George wrote on Venturi Scott Brown, and in it he expressed an appreciation for Venturi Scott Brown's utilization of semiotic theory, but raised some reservations about whether or not they went too far in distinguishing between the semiotic surface and I guess a signifying but deeper, I suppose, environment constituted by the architecture itself, let's say the depth of the architecture. And in thinking about this particular distinction and problematic one that you raised with regard to their work, it did make me wonder about how you draw the line between what constitutes surface and what constitutes depth, how you actually distinguish between, can we not consider the so-called spatial field, I suppose, the environment, a semantic one as well, and how do you distinguish between those aspects of the architecture which are problematically on the surface and those which constitute what we might think of as substance? Anyway, I will leave it at that, and we will come back to these questions, I hope.
Great, thank you, Robert.
I met George recently. So my appreciation for George, it's a more intellectual one. Since, let's say, I don't have... Since, let's say, I don't have...
It wasn't acquired at cocktail parties.
No. Since, let's say, I don't really have personal memory for, say, to share about George. And I do believe that I think that one main difference, let's say, from the previous generation is the fact that I truly believe that my generation now is living in a kind of post-intellectual phase. So that's why I started looking at George, mostly because I was looking for somebody and that can provide me some kind of thinking about, let's say, the building itself. And when I started looking at George, I was looking for something else, let's say, beyond, for example, the example provided by Manfredo Tafuri. I'm going really quickly through this, and I think this kind of presentation can be really good, let's say, to start a conversation, let's say, bring up some points for this conversation. So the main thing is that I came from Italy, and it's really important, let's say, and saying from, let's say, cultural context. And from cultural context, we should, let's say, recognize that after Manfredo Tafuri, we didn't have any kind of influential architecture critic. So the only, let's say, when today we talk about, let's say, criticism, architecture criticism in Italy, the only reference is still, let's say, Manfredo Tafuri. So I was looking for something else, because, I mean, for several reasons. And I started, let's say, looking through several people, then George, let's say, feels, let's say, more or less in this sequence. And so the sequence that I was looking at was the one where we can find Colin Rowe, for example, Ignacio de Sola Morales, Alain Colquhoun, and then, let's say, George Baird. Now, why, for example, I found George Baird interesting? Mostly for this idea of using theory as a way to, let's say, establish and define the architecture within, let's say, a broader context than the building itself, than the practice itself. So in this case, and see, let's say, in the building something, let's say, different, some kind of meaning, mostly. Those images are. And also it was interesting for this kind of phenomenal approach. And I think I always found very difficult talking about the phenomenological approach using just word. I think it's, George, it's really good, but I think it's also interesting to look at George writing as a way to, for example, combine where, let's say, images and text, they always have a really strong relationship. So, for example, when he wrote this essay on Alvar Aalto, he, let's say, make new photos. So those are other images. For example, his focus also in this kind of phenomenological approach is focused on this detail that mediates, let's say, in between different scales. And also this kind of idea that we can establish some kind of continuity within the architecture as a discipline. So we can almost talk about these in-between elements, looking at Alvar Aalto, but at the same time looking at the architecture of Frank Gehry. For example, this is the foyer of the Walt Disney Concert Hall, where, let's see, I think George focused his attention mostly on the interior space, but I think it was interesting in trying to apply his, let's say, his investigation of these in-between elements to the foyer. And also this idea that it's possible, talking about politics in architecture, using disciplinary elements. So how, let's say, architecture defines space without recurring to an extra-disciplinary connection, but looking how architecture defines politics through space and form. So, for example, in this case, this is the Civic Center in Senaioke by Alvar Aalto. Comparison between Sharon and Gehry. And also, let's say, how it's possible to define and a new monumentality. So that's, for me, it was also an interesting and important question. So this is a project by Machado Silvetti. And also how the work of George almost define a theory for a middle ground, or let's in architecture. So I think we need to, when I talked with George, George said, don't put, let's say, the vacant lottery as image, because not everybody, let's say, knows about this. But I think the placing vacant lottery in this sequence is really important, because we can define a new territory to investigate this idea in between these two volumes, so between, let's say, Tillage, New York and College City. They've been published in the same area, but I think in terms of contemporary approach, I found, let's say, the vacant lottery is still, let's say, really, really relevant. And also this kind of 5 questions that Colin Rowe in some way put at the end of the introduction of 5 architects. And for me, those, let's say, I didn't know these 5 questions. So I discovered, why I put these 5 questions? Because I discovered these 5 questions reading, let's say, this essay by George Opposition in the think of Colin Rowe. And I found these 5 questions still really relevant. And also, I think that George Baird writing is in some way providing a really interesting answers to this kind of question that Cory Law was not really able to do. And also, it's interesting how, for example, George looked at the contemporary architects. And he talked about, let's say, contemporary architects in a way that arise a discussion about the city and arise a discussion about, let's say, competition. For example, this was a comparison between two different schemes for this famous competition mid-70s about Roosevelt Island. And it's interesting how, for example, George, talking about the contemporary architects, they make in some way, they claim a position. And also talks about, let's say, how architecture defines time and space in a completely different way. Comparing, for example, Ungers and this proposal by Ungers is one, and this is recalled. And it's interesting how already in this scheme, George recognized some, let's say, difficulties that Srem Koolhaas and OMA encounter in dealing with the large-scale project. And also it's interesting because also Robert was saying this is dogma style. These drawings are dogma style. This project is a project.
That was a trick.
It was, yeah. And it was interesting because I found the same drawing in the vacant lottery. So I think there is still a lot of space and a large room, let's say, to develop George, let's say, idea about architecture and city. So those are other images, for example, about the figure ground. And about those, it's where, let's say, more, where images to ask questions, to ask some question to George. I don't think this going to, I don't know if there will be time. And also I was, let's say, interested in talking with George about this image. Because these images show how Cory Law was interested in properties. It was interesting in the urban lots. This is a thesis by David Graham Shea. It was, Cory Law was his thesis advisor. And also, I mean, really interesting because, let's say, like Adolf Loos, for example, Adolf Loos has a strong relationship with a specific city, like Vienna, we can absolutely say that George Baird's theory and George Baird approach is deeply rooted in Toronto. I think, and also last question, something that I really found interesting in the work by George, in the writing by George, is this idea of decorative architecture. But I think we're going to discuss this topic in the conversation. Thank you, George.
There's a lot of material to, I guess, peruse a bit. I mean, maybe we could think about certain themes that we would like to collectively address. All of you, of course, and Roberto, you end with the image, or no, you didn't, it was the one before this, of Toronto. And I think there's talk about the city, but there's also talk about this city and George's continual return, in fact, to Toronto over a period of years, and his deep analysis of the particulars of this place, and then a bit later of the North American city. And I think that it's important to make a distinction between a more, let's say, conceptual idea of what the city might be with its diversity and multitudes, and this city, which has a very specific history and a very specific, or specific histories and way of development. Toronto, yes, no. Toronto. So each of you brought up the city, I think, in one way or another, and I'm wondering, maybe Robert,
well, George,
we could come back down and talk a bit.
I mean, George, and because I've read them all in a row, I'm not going to be sure if I remember which.
Which
one
is
of the essays, George does talk about the how the number of figures who have come from Toronto, ending with Naomi Klein, but also you mentioned Doug Saunders' book on entry.
Arrival City.
What was the preceding text that you meant? Oh, of course, the Jane Jacobs arrival here. But I mean, maybe there's something which, I mean, is, maybe I'm the hedgehog, but I was thinking about how the attention to the lot and the idea that the lot, which is a regulated unit of land, which is repeatable, which shapes buildings, which is determined through a kind of the concord of law and the public through political procedures, produces the arena in which architecture unfolds. That there is something about the urban theory which is related to like the textures and qualities of Toronto investigated in Vacant Lottery, which set the ground for a lot of the positions and sentiments around that relationship between individual and public, and that Toronto somehow, I don't know if it's, I don't want to say because it wasn't subjected to some of the ravages of urban renewal, because it was to some extent but maybe that somehow it was more self-evident in Toronto some of the virtues of this interplay between individual agency and public realm that helped to set the stage for a disposition, let's say, an intellectual disposition.
This may be odd and maybe almost unpopular to say, but I think one of the advantages of working on Toronto and maybe even being from Toronto over the period of time we're talking is that Toronto is a kind of city in the state of becoming, and it has a certain generic quality. It's in North America, but it's it was settled under an English system, so it has this kind of interesting relationship both to cities in the United States, but also to European cities, and I think that's what's interesting about it, and what might make it, as an object of study, something which is particular to here, but is also, in a sense, exportable.
Right.
I was struck, for example, some of you might know this, but I was speaking to the thesis students recently about Stephen Hall's pamphlet architecture and the was it North American housing types? Yes.
Yeah.
And I was interested because there was a housing type from Philadelphia, but there was a very similar housing type from Philadelphia that also developed in Toronto that was brought to light for Hull by George, the semi-detached, and was part of the documentation in that book. So it's similar but different to what was happening in a kind of emergent mercantile city of the 19th century, which is an interest of this kind of gridded mercantile city as the typical morphological city. Is an interest of George. It was an interest of Colin Rose, because he talked about Austin and other cities in that way. That kind of openness and the general form was an important principle to understand, as opposed to the highly specific way of articulating the city in late modernism.
It was interesting for you to describe Toronto as a city that is becoming, because I was interested to read in George's piece the kind of collective sigh of relief that you described in the 70s, early 70s, I guess, when Toronto had avoided in some way the kind of fate of many other American cities in terms of the kind of race riots and disarray and massive effects of urban renewal and so forth, and that it also had felt that it had become at that point in some ways, you didn't quite use those words, but that it had arrived or had been delivered in some fashion from an alternative history somehow. And that, of course, coincident with the building of the TD Center and many of the other larger buildings that transformed the skyline at that point in time.
But it's arriving again now.
But it's arriving again. So, I mean, I wonder if it's a kind of generational conceit, that somehow one has to always cast its, one's own milieu in a way that is projective, or whether, these kind of cycles are cycles that, in fact, can be more closely documented. Roberto, join in.
I found, let's say, George's writing on the architecture on the city really interesting, because even though his work is rooted in, let's say, Toronto, I always found that he always looked in some way in the terms how, in a way that placed Toronto within a broader context. I really felt, I found it interesting because always, because George writing, and this generation mostly play a role as a kind of transatlantic exchanger between wherever was happening, whatever is happening in North America and wherever was happening, for example, in Europe. But for George, let's say Europe was not really enough. So he tried to, let's say, connect and test his idea about the city, for example, in Tokyo. So from this point of view, Toronto is George, let's say, base for his investigation. But at the same time, it's interesting for me how he sees, let's say, his research as something that can be, let's say, in some way applied and tested at the scale of, in different cities, even though all of them, they're pretty specific. So from, let's say, Toronto, Las Vegas, Rome, to, let's say, to Tokyo. So this idea of being an intellectual that reflects on the city with some specific, let's say, roots, but at the same time try to look outside these roots and try to challenge it himself always, I found this very, very interesting. And if I can bring, let's say, this is something maybe that's personal that I see, and I didn't mention in the in my short, let's say, presentation, was that something that really interests me in that generation was the idea of, or the approach of linking and expanding the role of the architect and the possibility of the architecture in the world. So George is a designer, writer, theoretician, teacher. What is George's job? But that's something, so this is something that redefined completely the role and of the architects in the world. So the architect, it's not just a practitioner, it's not just a designer, it's not just a writer. So the architect as a person, let's say, interesting in the city as a public realm, is somebody who does almost all of that. And it's interesting how, for example, George used one dimension, for example, writing, to investigate the other. Without, he never, let's say, in some way keep the two dimensions detached. He never see the practicing and or designing or theorizing as something that's detached, as something you can see separately. They always work together, and they have to work together. So this is something that I don't know if it's something that you think.
Maybe it's interesting because George does mention. I mean, part of in the Venturi Scott Brown essay, perhaps as if it were a cautionary tale to that. The observation is that that their theory doesn't describe what, in fact, that they have done, and George makes the argument that the work is more duck than decorated shed, and that there is something about the perhaps the impossibility of that kind of binding together. I don't know. I mean, we're talking about you, and you at some point will have to perhaps answer.
Sometime very soon.
But
Yeah, but
well, for
Yep.
all the figures that you put up there from this period, they all had very different relationships to either their own practice or affiliations with very particular architects. You know, for Tafuri, for Rowe, and I think what is different about what we see in these essays is that George had his own practice. He doesn't theorize that, except maybe in some of the urban work so much. And he's much more free or much more flexible, as I said, or open to engaging and criticizing a broader array of work, you know, whether it's gray or white or all these things, instead of staying in the camp. Whereas even, you know, we can look at Colin Rowe and say, you know, whether it's Sterling, which architects are aligned or are seen as the symbiotic with the, or as you know, they're either theoretical agents for or drawing impetus from, and that was sometimes very powerful in the moment, but can sometimes be a limitation.
yeah, but this is something that we some way see today retroactively. Mm-hmm. Because I mean, if
You see it very attractively.
no retroactively,
Yeah.
because if we see, for example, Aldo Rossi, when he wrote Let's Say Architecture, he was not interested in supporting his, let's say, architecture, his design. He was a really young practitioner. When when Colas published Delirious Nork, it was a bestseller, not for architects. So this is something so that's why I think George writing is interesting, because it doesn't really establish this continuity between theorizing and designing. And this is something you can find in all these theoreticians. It's because now, after this kind of postmodern, we look through all these concepts. We looked at this concept through their authors' work, that we consider that they use their writing to, let's say, reinforce their design. But at that time, it was absolutely not like this.
This makes me.
I think it depends on the figure, but
Yeah, talking about this figure.
Yeah.
That's why they use writing to establish a common ground and to expand the possibility of the discipline. There was absolutely no a selfish kind of approach where they try to push their design work through their writings. I don't think so.
I have a sort of different angle on it. I think it's a related question, I hope. Because one of the things that strikes me in the particular, those things to which George addresses his theory, and it goes back to this question that I have about the Venturi Scott Brown essay, which distinguishes between, I'm not sure if it's the right terminology as you used it, but what is the sort of environment, the depth of the building, which itself is a signifying realm in which social practice occurs, and the surface. It raises a question for me in a way that has to do with the appearance of buildings, because in some ways, if I think about the very strong characterization of, the wonderful essay on Aalto, the description of the handrails I remember from the first reading 20 years ago, or longer probably, and then the observations about those like the social, to borrow the term used more about OMA, but the social condenser aspects of the Sharoon building, they are more about how physical environments shape and choreograph human interaction in social environments, and they are about immersion in architecture, and they don't deal with the objectification of the building, that you see it from without or outside of oneself, rather than being immersed in it. It's not in this. It can include this. The objectification may be something that is apprehended even in a state of distraction, but sometimes even in a state of concentration, and it goes to this question of, like, what should a building look like? And how does that relate to?
Can I jump in for just a second? I think because I did want to come back to your question, Robert, about, I guess, the extent of the semantic field and the question of depth versus surface. And I think, for me, I was really excited to read in George's essay on Venturi and Scott Brown and Eisenhower to find a word like decorum and propriety, and to talk about the kind of knowingness, or the fact that there is there's a field of operations or a field of relations that, in fact, construct meaning and the apprehension of an architectural work, that it can't simply be that thing. And I think a very potent example, in fact, is the town hall, San Yatzello, and the relationship of the meeting hall or the meeting room with the courtyard. And in fact, it's a relationship which is hard to consummate visually, except for in terms of the courtyard and the massing of that space. You can't actually be in one and see the other, but mentally one knows that relationship exists, and in fact that they're a kind of volume, I think, is a way of understanding that relationship. Or coming to the example of the Disney Concert Hall, and thinking about just the kind of hibernation or the punitive aspect of moving and shuffling to one's seat and back down without this kind of social connection, and the privileges or joys of that kind of interaction in space, I think, are embedded in words like decorum. And I don't think probably at the time that was a very fashionable word to use, but it was a very precise one to me, and redolent of a kind of 19th century reading
But
of action, you know, in a sense, or governance.
But what I also thought was provocative about that essay is, you know, using the word decorum, which is there's clearly a kind of, and it feels very odd speaking with George, about this with George just sitting here. I just have to say, but was using referring to the need for audacity, right? So one of the things I think is interesting to ask the question of what is the difference between audacity and sort of being avant-garde, right? And when you talk about the need for audacity, and to use the word decorum when you're talking about learning from Las Vegas, that's a certain kind of audacity, because they clearly wanted to engage, you know, on one hand, the disaggregation of the environment that the car produced, and on the other, the kind of crassness of commercial architecture in ways that they felt the field was not looking at. So, and there's not a lot of decorum in either of those things, right? In their effect on the built environment, and they were responding to God's own junkyard and the kind of demonization of the honky-tonk environment in North America. So that's what I think was audacious about learning from Las Vegas at the time, because otherwise, what the theory of the decorated shed, in my view, is a kind of re-articulation of the Baroque, and basically saying that architects should be more free to make the exterior and the urban role of a building and the urban performance of a building do different things than it should do than it can do in its interior, right? And in fact, in my view, Frank Gehry ended up doing that much more successfully than them because he made the exterior much more three-dimensional. But it's still very much a kind of, his buildings can, I think, still be read very much as decorated sheds, and sometimes their weakness is that, in that they are a series of sometimes very shed-like volumes that then get kind of tricked out in terms of their expression. So I think it's interesting to read this. That's why I wonder whether when you asked this question about how much, I asked it. I think I posed it differently. How much have the terms changed, or are we looking at the same phenomena, or are they different phenomena, even though some of the forms might be the same? I was probably speaking more about the theoretical frameworks. Have we really gotten beyond the questions of phenomenology and semiotics and these other or a return to a certain technological in the rehearsal of the technological regimes of late modernism now? Is it something different now, right?
Right. But I thought that I have thought that the reason for the return to the technical and objectivist discourses is in part because, there's something professionally expedient about it, and there's something politically expedient about it, which is that plural publics are it's hard to get agreement in a complicated political field. And so architects will frequently turn to that which most people can agree upon, which is, the maximizing amenity and the provision of healthy environments is something that everybody can agree on. What they won't admit is that their commitments are galvanized by things which are often external to these agreeable areas of discussion around, objective.
But wasn't learning from Las Vegas and complexity contradiction a kind of outing of the importance of
yes.
of those dimensions?
Yeah, but you see, what I think is that what's
beauty?
happened is that we've returned. Once again, we've returned to sort of. I guess it's whether it's questions of sustain. Everything has to be justified according to questions of amenity and performance, and that these are terms which can obtain public consent. And so that there's a kind of in a way there's a convergence of political necessity and technocratic speak. It's the same reason that technocratic logics are appealing because they can supersede political debates. So this is why I was thinking that in some respects there was something about the the 1960s appeal that is present once again today, and in both cases it's trying to overcome or subvert or get around the messy reality of a plural society's difficult democratic procedures, or at a smaller scale, the agreement of clients.